speaker is Dr. deShazo, ex-president of this organization, formerly the long-serving chair of the University of Medicine at the University of Mississippi, who is going to talk to you about the politics of grant writing and submission. Rick.
Well, good afternoon. We're glad you're here. The point of my visit with you is to let you know it's not all about having good scientific ideas and writing them down on paper. Getting grant funding that lasts for more than one cycle it requires a lot of work on your own part. Scouting, I think that's probably the best way to say it. Scouting the environment and learning a little bit more about yourself if you've never written a grant before than perhaps you knew. Because once you are successful, it brings you into an environment where you're having to collaborate with other people. And if your people skills are not up to par, the whole operation can melt down fairly quickly. And I have been in situations over the years where I've had difficulty with collaborators myself, so I speak with some experience, and some of the time I was the problem. So let's talk a little bit about a few things that perhaps are worth knowing. The first thing on the handout is the magic NIH site that has 3 videos on there. If you've never watched those videos, it's a good place to sort of get oriented. And there are directions on there for further information in all of the 3 key areas that they discuss. Getting your ideas together, how you assemble your thoughts, and so forth and so on. And you'll hear more about that as we go through the afternoon. I think the starting place for everyone is getting to know the folks in your own particular grants office at your own institution. They can make or break you very quickly. Although it is frequently, although you ought to consider them, although they ought to be considered as a user-friendly organization there to help you, sometimes their opinion is that you are gifted by their presence. So you have to be very, very careful in dealing with them because their cooperation is very much needed. The best way to find out about them is to talk with someone who's already dealt with them, and that will give you some needed information. But the best way I have found to go into the grants management office at the institutions I've worked in is as a supplicant, asking for assistance with great humility and being grateful for every gift of information that you get, knowing that you have to go back several times to get what information you need to know. Why that group? Well, you can't submit this grant by yourself. It is an institutional grant, and no matter if it is a private grant supported by Shell Oil or whatever private group you can get to, American Cancer Society, American Heart, they still own the money. The money is not yours, and at least that's their point of view. And so they have a number of hot button issues that they're dealing with that you don't even know about. Recently at our institution, we had a major HIV related study and that had all of the patient's information on a single computer encrypted, but the encryption was done by someone who didn't know how to encrypt it. And that was, someone picked that up and had the names of all these participants, and it triggered an immediate investigation at the federal level. And we had lots of people around who didn't speak Mississippi telling us which way to march. So those sorts of unintended consequences are very important, and you get that information from having some educational time with your local grants management office. They usually have someone who is a scientist running these offices, often someone who has been in the field for many years and is no longer writing grants. But there is always an attorney somewhere in the environment. Most grants management offices now have an attorney in place. And the reason for that has to do with fraud, abuse of patients, and people who have stolen money outright, not just fraud, but just taken money or equipment, and other things like that. And so you need to make sure that somewhere along the way you get a chance to meet as many people in that office as possible, develop relationships with them, and learn what issues they're dealing with before you ever put pencil to paper, because those are the people that are going to be very helpful to you. The federal compliance risk management components of grants includes not only humans, but I think frequently more focused on animals. Animals and radioisotopes. Those are the things that I have seen over the years that have gotten people in the biggest trouble, and as a department chair have gotten me in trouble from time to time when they unintentionally violated some obscure rule that they didn't even know about. So I think that would be likely to be helpful to you as a first stop. Before you write your first grant, it's very important to have a conversation with yourself. Do you really want to do this? Do you really want to do it on the topic you're thinking about? Are you actually interested in that topic? And is it a short or a long-term interest? Most people who have been successful with grants are people who pick a problem and stick with that problem throughout their career. They have a iteration in their knowledge about the topic. And that's number one, they have a long-term interest. And number two, it's a unique or fairly unique problem that nobody else is working on, right? So right now, if you wanted to run for president on the Democratic Party, you probably would have to think twice, because there are too many people wanting the same thing you want, and you don't have that much money. So if you're going to ask a common question, there's more than likely someone who's already tried, and through the Freedom of Information Act, you can get old NIH grants and look at other people's work over time. In fact, I'll tell you in just a minute where you may get a recommendation about that. So knowing your own strengths, weaknesses, research interests, motives, and motivation is very important. Now, most internists, if you're an internist, have a certain personality profile. We are perfectionistic, driven, somewhat insecure, obsessive compulsive like people who are workaholics. And one of the characteristics of that particular personality inventory is impatience. And that has been my fatal flaw over the years in just about every research project that I have performed, is that I always wanted the answer to come quickly and be through with it, where I could move on to doing something else I was interested in. So one of the things, if you're not sure about yourself and your own motivations And especially if you're planning to have a lab tech or lab techs, or to have someone in the same space that you're working in, is to take one of those personality inventory tests that someone in your clinical psychologist somewhere in your environment gives for faculty or trainees free. Most every institution has one of these. The department chair in each department knows who that person is because frequently people have told him to go take it, and he or she has taken it, and because they're having problems with interactions as well if they don't know themselves as well as they should. That can check on things like how you handle stress, and stress management techniques are very, very effective and easy to use if you know how to use them. I have a whole inventory to use at different times. Like, I was asleep when he called me just a minute ago. I was so tired from last night and said I was late and I thought I had the time all right. So I'd used one of those on the way down here, which is a breathing technique. And all of you that have anxiety, as many internists have, cover it up. Not effectively, but we do. These techniques can be very, very helpful. So that's a gift I wish someone had given me about 40 years ago, but I had to learn it the hard way. The environment. You're going to be living, if you have not performed a research study before, an environment with which you are not familiar. There will be people that you have to interact with and seek help from, seek forgiveness from others who you have never met before because of you are contracting for services, equipment, animals, and so forth. And getting to know who is easy to work with and who is not in your environment is another important first thing to do. And the best way to learn that is to do some homework with more than one, multiple individuals who are presently funded in your environment. This is particularly important for women who are working in male-dominated environments. We have a daughter who is in academic medicine, who is even shorter than I am, and so she is always thought of as a child in the environment. And when anybody comes into her environment, they think she is the lab tech. So she has found ways to deal with this problem, some of which are rather invasive and others are very simple. And so there's, because of our long-term history of old white men doing research, there are diversity and inclusion issues that you have to be prepared for. And research is a place where people can get away with behaviors that they can no longer get away with in the clinical environment. So you have to be prepared to know who you're working with, try to carefully select anyone that you want to be a mentor, and make sure that person is a mentor for the right reason. If you have been in pre-medical curricula in college, you know that there was always someone who was trying to sabotage the experiments where he or she could get a better grade. Those people are now your co-workers because most of them never got caught. They got into medical school, nobody picked them up, and there's some of those in the mix. So the mix of physicians or PhDs or whatever graduate level program you are in is the same mixture of people that you knew when you were in your undergraduate work. And you know that some of those people are totally reliable and wonderful folks who are well-intentioned. Some of them aren't. So you have to be able to discriminate your environment, the best way to learn that is from other people who've already been working in your environment. Laboratory assistants are another very important area because most of us are doing more than one job and don't do full-time lab work. Many laboratory assistants are people who are frustrated because they have not gotten other jobs that they wanted. They are people who didn't get into medical school, people who are still trying, and so forth. And you have an opportunity to provide a real service to those people and helping them move their career forward to get to where they want to go. So I think that every scientist who has other employees should consider themselves as a mentor to the people that are working with them, not as a doobie. And your colleagues will find out about that very quickly from your attitudes. The way that you ask them to do things, the way that you pick up when they're having trouble, the way that you don't blame them when the experiment blows up. Those kinds of things are the things that make a long time relationship very helpful. And putting them on papers as often as possible is also very, very important, especially if they are intimately involved. But each institution and each journal has a requirement for the level of involvement in a project that you will be doing, and it is always easy to put your tech on there, and sometimes difficult to put your boss on there. So working through those issues is key, but your tech has a lot more invested in what he or she is doing than is obvious in many cases. The other part of the environmental issue is getting to know the whole scope of resources that are available with you. I've already talked to you a little bit about grants management issues. There are people all over institutions that you never hear about. Veterinarians. Most if you're doing animal research, most institutions now have a full-time veterinarian who may actually be a researcher as well, and trained and certified laboratory technicians, and a whole set of rules about the way things can be done. There are also extreme levels of security related to animal research, primarily because of PETA's constant activity. In Mississippi, you would think that there wasn't a PETA chapter, but that we had one of the most active ones, and our security was broken through on several occasions. So people are very, very sensitive about the animal safety piece. The biggest initial problem that most people have is with budgets. There are very finite ways that the NIH and most of the other funders, the VA and others, follow the similar pathways, have to have the budgets done. And the reason for that is all the budgets that are submitted and the projects that are funded are audited numerous times. And they want to be in the position to say that if something happened, if the deliverables weren't met, it wasn't their fault. They're not so concerned about your situation because they're really bean counters, but you have to learn to do things their way rather than telling them some other way that would be more convenient or effective for you. And making them angry is a fatal flaw. So much like the folks in the front office who do all of the legal and other issues, getting to know a grants management specialist can help you, because you may have to rebudget if you get pregnant or ill or something. You may have to have an intervention where you renegotiate your contract, your budgets, and so forth, and they can be very helpful in that regard. Supporting colleagues. It's always easier to do research with a collaboration with others. It's always more difficult to do research with a collaboration of others, if you know what I mean. Having a colleague that you trust and respect is very, very important. If you're fortunate enough to have a mentor who brings you in as a colleague and actually spends time with you and teaches you the right things to do, you are extremely fortunate. And that certainly is the best way to do this. If you and another junior investigator decide to work on a project under a mentor who is not really that involved, that is more complicated. And the relationship that is established in the mentor-mentee relationship and the co-investigator relationship is best put in writing, because that way there are no misunderstandings. Some people feel that's not necessary, but in my career I have always worked with a very diverse group of folks coming from very different environments than mine, and what I have found most useful is discussing our relationship with each other in a very honest way, and then putting it in writing or asking them to put their part in writing, and then having it. And from time to time when differences come, it's useful to pull that out and look at it again. And it can be very helpful. It doesn't mean the relationship can't be changed at any time, but at least have an oral discussion of this topic, if not writing it down. Getting someone who can critique your work is also very important. And frequently, that is going to be not only your mentor, it's going to be someone else. I have always looked for, appreciated, and valued the friendship of English majors. And the NIH wants a readable, cogent, thoughtful proposal, not something that you have to constantly scratch your head trying to figure out what the investigator is trying to do. One of the things I was taught when I first went on study sections many years ago, and I've been on a whole series of them, is if you're having trouble as a grant reviewer understanding or having to spend a lot of time working your way through a grant to figure out what's going on, reject it. We don't have time to fool with it. If this person can't get to the point and tell you in clear English what's going on, just don't waste your time. And so I was a chemistry major, not an English major. My English has improved, but it is I still put punctuation in the wrong place and things like that. And I tend to use run-on sentences because it's more convenient than writing individual sentences. And so you may want to have someone who is an English person read your work, and then you may want to have someone critique it up front, and it may be someone that you wouldn't normally think about. It might be your significant other. It might be someone that you just happen to know, because if someone who you just happen to know can't read through there and generally understand why you're doing what you're doing, even if they don't understand the technology part, it's not right. So that can save you a lot of grief as well. Then finally, and there are many other things we'll talk about, but I'm out of time, and much of the material that you need is going to be on the NIH website. Much of it's not, but much of it is. There's a little bit about fundraising. if you're working in an area that has a sponsoring group like American Heart, American Rheumatism Association, so forth and so on, most of those organizations have startup grant funds. And it is very difficult to get any grant funded that does not have some preliminary data in the grant. You have to have demonstrated that if you're doing very basic work, that you can use a pipette and centrifuge. And if you're doing more cognitive stuff that involves other fields of medicine, you also have to have, there's some preliminaries that they want to see that you have. The person that can help you know this area better than anything else is the executive of the study section to which you will direct your grant. There is a person in Bethesda who has been there usually for a long time as the executive secretary of the study section to which your grant will go, that knows more than you can ever get them to tell you. Their job is to recruit you into writing a grant. And for many years I had a colleague who was always going to Bethesda to meet with a study section director, executive, and I could never figure out why this person spent 1 or 2 years a year in Bethesda talking to people. But I soon found out that her grants always got funded and mine frequently didn't. And she had developed a relationship with the executive secretary of the study section to which her work area usually goes to. And she could pick up the phone and call her and get information about what the competition was going to be, whether the area she was planning on submitting a grant in already had submissions in the pot, or had old submissions, or had ancient submissions, and whether or not some of those were available through the Freedom of Information Act for her to look at. So she had a stack of old grants that were written that were very helpful because they were iterative. These grants, some of these grants went on for 10 or 15 years, and every time a new one was submitted or a progress report was submitted, there was new information in there, and she could sort of learn about what has already been looked at. That would allow her to cite that in her grant, and also what she had to do. So that's probably more and other than what you wanted as a starting place, but I hope it will at least get you to think about doing your homework before you spend hours and hours and hours writing a grant, and focus tightly on your environment, your relationships with others, your personal ability, and what really you want to get out of the process. Why don't you add into what I said, critique my comments, because you've been there too, and as a dean, and I didn't even mention the dean issue,
just as well not to,
which is another equation in this. The department chair and the dean, depending on the dean, the department chair is under little pressure or a great deal of pressure to get young people involved in grant writing, because depending on which place you're in, there may be money involved for the department. So that's another thing. Why don't you introduce her and comment on that?
Okay,
your timing is, as
your
usual,
timing is perfect.
Perfect.
So, Will, just to comment on some of the things Dr. deShazo said, his insights are, as always, insightful and useful. The role of the dean in this process is, in most places, less important to the investigator than that of the department chair. Circumstances where that is different are when a project is going to require massive resources, which in most places are more likely to be owned by the dean than necessarily to be owned by the department, or if it's going to cut across a lot of areas, in which case the dean may need to break down some silos. For the most part, the dean's role is going to be largely reflected through the department chair, telling the department chair, well, you need to get some more, usually something along the lines, you need to get some more people with grants, and of the people you have with grants, they need to get bigger grants that last longer. But the dean's role is largely to develop resources which will wind up getting distributed in most cases to the department chairs. So
I think getting to know those program officers and scientific review officers is a really good advice. And you don't have to go to Bethesda necessarily. You're going to be guaranteed that if you're working on inflammatory bowel disease, when you go to the GI meeting, all those people are there. And I've noticed a lot of times they're standing around by themselves at poster sessions, and you can't buy them a cup of coffee. That's against the rules. But you can have nice conversations and get to know them at professional meetings because they're there. The people that are running your portfolio about your disease, about your problem are going to be at the major scientific meetings.
And they're usually really nice people.
And they're always lovely, and they want to help you. And
they really do.
And they want to get to know you. Yeah, they want to get to know you too. And they want to sign you up to review grants, and be on committees too. But they can be very helpful. It's very, very good advice to get to know them.
So that's excellent advice. And another comment along those lines is, while they will be at your big society meetings, if you go, you will frequently also meet them at small topic-focused meetings where you will actually have more of a chance, perhaps, to engage with them one-on-one. I used to always meet my program officers and get to know them at the Gordon Conference for my area, for example. But things, smaller, disease-focused things are a very good way of getting